I'd like to call this meeting of the Kenmore City Planning Commission to order. It is February 18th at 7 o'clock. Will the clerk please take the roll?
Commissioner LaSalle, Commissioner Olson,
Here.
Commissioner Macias,
Here.
Commissioner Vanderland,
Here.
Vice Chair Thompson,
Here.
Chair Bonashinsky,
Here.
and is Commissioner Dorian excused?
Yes, please excuse Commissioner Dorian. All right, next on our agenda, we have the land acknowledgement.
We acknowledge that the city of Kenmore is situated upon the ancestral lands of the Snohomish, Snoqualmie, Saxawatl, Duwamish, Stillaguamish, Tulalip, Suquamish, Muckleshoot, and other tribes who are part of the Coast Salish peoples. We recognize and express our deepest respect for their enduring stewardship and profound relationship with this land, which they have cherished and protected since time immemorial. We honor the First Peoples, acknowledge their vibrant cultures, and commit ourselves to learning from their wisdom in our journey to promote justice, equity, and mutual understanding. We pledge to stand alongside these communities in acknowledging past injustices and working towards a future that respects and celebrates the diverse heritage of this land.
Please join me in standing for the pledge. Okay, next on our agenda is public comment. Clerk, is there anyone signed up for public comment?
Thank you, Chair. We have no one on site or signed up for virtual public comment this evening.
All right. In that case, we can move on to the consent agenda. I will entertain a motion to approve the consent agenda.
So moved. Second.
Okay, moved and seconded. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, the consent agenda passes unanimously. Next on our agenda, we have a presentation by Mike Stanger from a regional coalition for housing about middle housing affordability. I don't know if Todd or Debbie, if you want to say anything ahead of the presentation or not, but you are welcome to do so. Otherwise, thanks for being here, Mike.
Thank you, Chair. So the reason Mike is here tonight is to provide context as part of the middle housing discussion. I know when you met with the City Council, there was some discussion about not having an affordable housing requirement, but being as it is an option, we just wanted to make sure that you had that context as part of the discussion when you're talking about the regulations. So Mike is graciously here this evening to give a presentation to provide some context about how the affordability requirement relates to H-Bill 1110, how other jurisdictions have incorporated an inclusionary component, so you can have that in the back of your mind as you're having the later discussion about the rest of the regulations. So on that, Chair, if it's okay, I will turn it over to Mike for the presentation.
Well, thank you for having me here. It's been a couple of years, I think, since I've been at least in person, but I recognize a few of your faces, and it's nice to see you again. I wanted to dive right in by focusing on one part of House Bill 1110, or the middle housing legislation that the city's dealing with now, and particularly the part that you're aspiring as a tier 2 city, which requires that cities must allow 4 units per lot within a half mile of major transit, and anywhere that the builder agrees to make 1 unit affordable. You know this already. And you probably also know that cities are not strictly confined to this. And so that's what I'd like to bring back to your attention today, that the Commerce's Department has made it clear in their guidance that cities can adopt other affordable housing programs, including inclusionary housing or incentives to gain affordable housing through the new density that the middle housing bill requires. And so So I'd like to offer some information to give you something to chew on. And hopefully we'll be able to continue talking about this, how Kenmore can take advantage of it. So again, my name is Mike Stanger, and I'm a planner with Arch. I've worked with Arch for over 14 years now, and helped administer programs of this nature, that is inclusionary housing incentive programs of various kinds in nearly all of our 15 cities that you see on the map there. Arch is a partnership of East King County cities that are within that boundary. Snoqualmie, North Bend are not members, nor is Duval or Carnation, but they have that option if they want to, just to clarify. But Arch exists to help cities cooperate, collaborate on funding and planning and administering various affordable housing programs, including, as I said, the work that I've been doing, which is a lot focused on land use-based or tax incentive-based affordable housing in otherwise market rate development. So when I speak to groups or we raise questions about affordable housing programs, usually the first question we get is, what do you mean by affordable housing? And in this context of middle housing, of course, a lot of the attention is given to these housing types being available and affordable for home ownership. So I wanted to give you some concrete as possible information on what that would mean if middle housing became technically affordable, that is regulated. And so, for instance, at the 80% of median income level for two people, they would have to have an income of less than $94,000 or so to qualify for that. Or for a family of four, it goes as high as $117,000, $118,000 during the current year. And the maximum housing expense for that situation of a family of four would be just over $3,000 a month. That's based on 30% of the income of that $118,000. So the table in general is meant to give you an idea of the kind of the household incomes that we're talking about, that you might be able to serve with a program like this. And the jobs that people of those income levels, I've captured some of them in these two charts. The one on the left is the employment in various sectors that's been reported by PSRC. And you can see that the top category is public education, and then there's a number in retail, trade, construction, healthcare, and social assistance. And so I captured some of these and another variety of jobs that are often of interest to planning folks such as you. In the chart on the right-hand side to show how their average incomes in King County compare to those 80% or 60% limits. For example, the elementary school teacher, the average elementary school teacher in King County makes a little under $100,000. So that would, if that teacher were the sole income earner of a family of four, then that family would qualify for an affordable housing home that was priced at 80% of median, but not for one that was not if that teacher lived alone. Or you might compare that to an office clerk whose income is under $60,000 and would qualify for any housing at either 80 or 60, whether they had a family of 1, 2, 3, 4 people. So that's kind of how you read that chart. Stop me if you have questions. I'd be happy to answer. And to lay it out a little bit more in black and white, literally, I took two of those sectors that were heavily populated in Kenmore, the healthcare, social assistance, and public sector, public education, and to show how many of those jobs would qualify, you know, depending on their family size. Again, these are two of the sectors with the most jobs in Kenmore. So a big reason why we have information to share with you as ARCH is because a year ago, we took on a study on behalf of all the cities in our membership to look at what opportunities there might be stemming from middle housing growth. And just referring it to here as a feasibility study, it involved a lot of outreach to the construction and architecture community to find out what they believed was on the horizon, what was going to be marketable, what the costs of that middle housing development would be, how to measure the value that would create both for landowners and potentially that could be used for affordable housing. We did feasibility for 8 different prototypes of housing, ranging from duplexes and single-family homes up to cottage housing, townhomes, 4plexes, 6plexes, et cetera. Basically all the kinds that the law wants the cities to choose and make available through zoning. And we studied the feasibility for each of those prototypes with attention to the different costs of construction, the different purchase costs of land, with a special attention to single-family lots that had older homes, older, smaller homes that might be candidates for a builder to come in, or even the resident to replace with middle housing on that lot. And when we measured the potential profits of each of those scenarios, then our aim was to say if they were profitable enough to be feasible, then any profits we projected in excess of that threshold, we call that residual profits, and that would present an opportunity for affordable housing that would reduce the cost of housing or reduce the income that the developer might get without making the project infeasible. In other words, we could draw down conceptually on that residual profit, but not cut into that feasible income that they would be making. So that was our aim. And so backing up for a second to the conversations that we had with the people in the development community. And naturally, we found that East King County is very attractive and in fact, you know, I know as well as you do that Kenmore's experienced a lot of development of townhomes and smaller housing types, and so there's a lot of appetite for that out there, as there has been in Bothell and the surrounding communities. But we've also found, and we're told, that market rate prices for those housing units is not likely to be affordable for middle and lower income families, those that I illustrated earlier. In fact, I looked through the permit data for new condo and townhouse developments in the last 12 months in Bothell and Kenmore. And you can see here that the average prices in both cases are upwards of 175% of median income. So that is not likely to help the city achieve affordability goals in your comp plan, at least on the home ownership side. I mentioned that going back to the feasibility study, and that the potential there is that by adding density, it creates value for the landowner or the person who wants it to develop on the land. And so what we did was, and if I can walk you through quickly this chart, it's meant to illustrate how the total development costs, including the profit that's needed in this situation, a low density, single family detached home would be 2.6 million. And in the particular case, this was not from Kenmore, but I don't think it was, but it's an actual prototype that we studied. And the likely income would only be short of 2.5 million. So at that point, the project is not feasible. They're not likely to build a single family home on that lot. And so then to require affordability through a fee in lieu, that's what the FIL means. We can get into this more later, would further reduce the feasibility. And so that blue and yellow line shows that it's below the feasibility mark, and that's not going to work in that case. And we found a number of those, especially for the for projects that had fewer units. But on the same parcel or the same prototype, same acquisition costs, but different development costs, because this is a triplex now, and because they have 3 units and would build more saleable square footage, the income on that prototype would be 3.9 million. And so now they're in the red. And for the city to have a requirement of some affordable housing eats into that sum, but not so much that it makes the project infeasible. And so there's that blue bar there that indicates that the builder, this hypothetical builder, is still coming out ahead. So that's kind of what we've been studying. And I don't have specific results or conclusions to give you on Kenmore yet, but because we wanted this to be kind of introductory and to see if you're interested in us pursuing it further. But I would also draw your attention that in your code now, you do have voluntary incentives that are similar to what HB 1110 has introduced. Now your residential density incentive is mostly applicable in single family zones, and it has been used a couple of times, but not a whole lot. Naturally, in existing single family zones, they have the right to build 1 unit, and in HB 1110, they would have the right to build 2 units per lot. But RDI is a voluntary program. You could get 2 bonus units if you sold 1 at 50% of median, or you could get 1 bonus unit if it was 80% of median. So I guess what I'm thinking here, or suggesting that we could think about, is in effect adapting what you have already into a program that could gain some affordable housing following HB 1110. And it could be voluntary, it could be mandatory. And I also wanted to just make you aware that, and some of you have seen this before, but Kirkland and Redmond have had a lot of success with inclusionary zoning, including in single family projects Kirkland's inclusionary program now applies to their medium and higher density zones. But they've produced 53 units through various project types. These are home ownership. They produce many more rental units. But they've also collected over $5 million in fees in lieu, where the affordability requirement of 10% resulted in a fraction. And so rather than making all the fractions round up, they allow the developer to pay a fee to cover that fraction. Some of the examples are in the most expensive parts of town. So it's not the case that super high land values make this impractical. This one in Magnolia and Moss Bay, that's right just on a hill above downtown Kirkland. And here you can see they are able to make the project work for them, even though their market prices for a 3-bedroom are 1.9 million, and they're only getting less than $500,000 from the affordable unit. Redmond's a little bit different story in the way they have constructed their policy. Theirs actually covers the entire city, including single-family zones, and they've done this for a couple of decades. They require 10% set aside at 80% of median, and they give a bonus market unit for each affordable unit. And they have helped create 89 affordable units from these projects, and as you can see in the map, it's all over the city. Redmond does, unlike Kirkland, Redmond does not collect a fee in lieu, and they just do simple rounding when they get fractions. But these taken together have been provided good evidence to us, I think, that these programs are successful. Now, Redmond has already adopted their middle housing code amendments. And what they've done there is to increase the set aside from 10% of new units to 12.5%, justified by that increased value from the additional density. And what they will do going forward is for projects smaller than 10 units, they'll take a fraction, they'll take a fee in lieu of the fractional units. Practically speaking, that means if a project is fewer than 8 units, then they'll get a fee in lieu of that. When it gets to 8 units, then 12.5% equals 1 unit, so they'll get a unit on site. But here are a couple of examples I can leave you with. Here, a newer one is, and this is in the Willows Rose Hill area, where they got a couple of bonus units. One was the bonus for providing the affordable unit, and they got another one for doing some green building standards. And so instead of building 10 units on that site, they were able to build 12. And the affordable one sold for $376,000 versus the market rate units that were over $2 million. So it sounds crazy, but it can work. There's also, if you're interested in cottage housing projects, there are also a couple of well-known cottage housing projects over there that include affordable housing. And I might also mention finally that City of Sammamish has adopted theirs. I think Redmond and Sammamish are the only 2 cities of ours that have completed their updates. But Sammamish now has also inclusionary zoning in their single-family neighborhoods, which we're really excited about. They used an overlay system to do that, but basically they're requiring 10% at 80 AMI for any project. Now, they do have an exemption for, and this is something to consider also going forward. They were concerned that, you know, ordinary homeowners that might want to put an ADU or something in their backyard, that they not be hit with a affordable housing fee. And so they exempted units of under 1,000 square feet. So there's a lot of options out there to consider, things that could make it work for Kenmore. You know, I'm first to agree that one size doesn't fit all, but we have a lot of experience and would be happy to help you think through it.
Thank you so much for the presentation, Mike. Since it wasn't part of our packet, would it be possible for us to get it so that we can refer to it later? Yeah, and then probably post it online as well for the community. Okay. Does anybody have any questions for Mike? Go ahead, Chris. Commissioner Olson. Okay, Commissioner Vandelin and then Commissioner Olson.
Mike, welcome back. Question for you. For those cities that have opted for an in lieu of fee, how do they generally use those fees? Is there control or restrictions on how those dollars that are collected can be used?
Excuse me. For in lieu fees, in most cases, they go into the Arch Trust Fund. That is the pool of funds that that we manage for all cities, and that on an annual basis, our exec board, well, with help from a citizens advisory board, the exec board then recommends the funding back to the city councils. If in lieu fees, just like any general fund contributions that cities might make to the trust fund, the decisions on spending those are always come back to the city council for approval. It's not like you let go of that money when it's there. But it does make it more practical to manage. There have been occasions when cities have held on to the fees for a short period of time. And that usually happens when there's a project that's in the works and needs the money quickly. And so, again, as a practical matter, it's just easier for the city to pay it directly rather than going to our fund at Bellevue and then back out again. But generally, they go into the trust fund.
Commissioner Olson and then Commissioner LaSalle.
I was just curious about the 1+ unit project. What was that trying to get at exactly?
That's just meant to say any project that creates one or more new unit, that it applies to all projects.
Okay. That was my interpretation, but I was just kind of like, okay, it just applies to everything. So, okay.
Right. Thanks for asking.
And Commissioner LaSalle.
Thanks. I was actually wondering about that one as well. In the last example you shared, the Estimamish had a 10% for 80% AMI example that you had listed. Practically, just how is the enforcement going to happen for less than 10 net unit creations? Is it cumulative for a specific developer, or how do they plan on enforcing it?
Oh, well, it's like in this project, I don't know if it's visible still. Thank you. If it was this one. So there was a single builder involved here, and the builder signs an agreement with the city, and which Arch staff administer, and they agree to work with Arch to make that unit available. So when they tell us that it's ready to be marketed, then we will set the affordable price based on the current interest rate and area median income.
Yeah, thanks. So in this example, which is, as I see, a base density of 13 units, I can easily imagine how 10% of that is more or is at least 1 unit. But in development projects that are less than 10 units, how would you enforce a 10% of that needs to be affordable housing?
I see. Okay, thank you for clarifying. So if it was, say, an 8-unit project, then we would say that they have to provide 0.8 units, or let's say it was, in Redmond's case, that might be rounded up, but if you had a rule that it was not, then we would propose having a fee rate basically set on either on a per unit or a per square foot basis to say that, your 0.8 affordable units, you need to pay the city X number of dollars based on the value of one affordable unit being Y.
Great, thanks.
Is that
Yeah, no, it was I just didn't realize how a 0.8 unit actually exists. So I appreciate the clarification on the fee section.
Okay, Commissioner Macias, and then Commissioner Vanderlin, and then Commissioner Olson again. Yes, okay.
I just had a question on the home ownership. I know in some developments, recently here, there's restrictions on it's affordable as long as that's, they can't resell it and resell it back at market price. Do we have any sort of restrictions on these units that they're affordable for the lifetime of the home, or does that not apply?
Generally, the codes are written, and I think Kenmore is this way, that the homeownership units have to stay affordable for at least 50 years. So each successive homeowner signs that resale covenant restricting the next sale.
And Commissioner Vanderlin?
Yes, back to the fractional ownership or lieu of fee. So in that particular situation where you would be levying a 10% on 8, that money goes to Arch, but from the city on how that money would be used. That unit for that project itself, then all of those 8 units would then be saleable by the developer and owner at market rate.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Olson?
Is the 50 years, that's from the date of construction, or is that from each resale?
Each resale.
Okay. And then the other question I had is, what do fees typically look like per unit built? So it's 10% in lieu of fee, and I just heard the 56 units and the 5.15 million. So I got a number from that, but that's excluding rental units. So I'm assuming that the price per unit is lower, or am I misunderstanding something? I think I explained that horribly, sorry.
Well, it's difficult to say that there's a typical one. The fees that Kirkland has collected, we have calculated according, based on their code, each project, based on the difference between the cost to construct a prototype affordable unit on that site, so using that actual land cost and site development cost, but an affordable housing construction cost. So that's the total development cost of the unit minus the income that would come from selling the unit. And that gap there is what the city has been collecting, but it's varied from project to project because that's the way their system has been built. I can tell you that with Redmond's new code, they've established fees of $30 for attached housing types, middle housing, and $40 a square foot for detached housing types. And that was based on our analysis. But those builders will pay per square foot of the total project. So if a project is 6,000 square feet, then they'll pay $30 or $40 per square foot.
That answered my question perfectly. Thank you for understanding that. I was trying to figure out how exactly that would get calculated, and that makes a lot of sense. So that would just change over time.
Mhm. Well, it could be, one way that you might want to do it is rather than the way, Kirkland has done it where it changes project to project would be to have it fixed in your fee schedule. It could escalate each year by CPI or something. And then we could review it every few years and see if it's still reasonable.
Thank you.
Okay, Vice Chair Thompson and then Commissioner LaSalle.
Thank you. Appreciate your presentation. It's very well done. So is the covenant recorded on the title?
It's recorded on the land, yes.
Right, okay.
Commissioner LaSalle.
Sorry, it takes me a while to get through my thinking. So going back to the fee situation and the question you answered, I would be really interested in getting your recommendation or thoughts into how do we implement it to meet affordable housing goals, because most of Kenmore is already built and we're talking about rebuilding. And so non-used, non-allocated lots of 10 units or plus, we don't have that many of those. And so I would imagine that if we're implementing a 10%, 80% AMI rule like Sammamish did, we would rapidly end up in situations where where developers are always paying the fee, but there's no real affordable housing that actually gets built. So we stick to the intent, but we don't meet our affordable housing goals. How could we work around that issue?
That's a great question. And the best answer I can offer is that we, make the best efforts that we can together with city staff and nonprofit or potentially for-profit developers to identify sites, get site control at reasonable cost as possible. And that's really the number one key is being, I don't know if aggressive is the right word, but active in finding opportunities for places to have it happen in Kenmore versus letting it go to somewhere.
Okay. And in that case, a quick follow-up of, because of your understanding of what's being built in Kenmore versus what is still potentially buildable, how much would these rules and regulations actually impact our affordable housing goals versus how much of it will solely be working with those affordable housing developers to meet our affordable housing objectives?
Without having the figures all together to support this, I will go as far as to say that it's, as the state law says, well, if you need to be able to allow 4 units per lot if the builder is willing to do one affordable unit. I don't think that's going to happen. Or at least you won't get many of those. And so I think it's much more likely that what we would end up recommending if you want to go this route would be some percentage of the units that would be 10% as a common example, rather than 25%, as in 1 in 4. So the projects would have to be at least 10 units to generate one on site. And I think all those projects that I looked through and I had in the table, those were all half-acre and larger projects, and those, I don't have all the inventory in my head, but I think there are more opportunities like that in Kenmore.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Vanderlin and then Commissioner Olson.
So, Mike, I'm going to just make a statement, and at the end, after I've shown my ignorance, have you correct me. But the more we've talked about, or I've listened to conversation about in lieu of, I'm more impressed with that as an option for being able to fund affordable, truly affordable housing. If we can collect a type of development we're talking about with missing middle is going to be high end. It's going to be on expensive lots, and it's going to be wanting to build at the top of the market. Make even at 80% of that to be affordable 80% is just not feasible. But if we were to allow the builder to go ahead and build what they want and what the market will provide at the top end, and we're able to get an in lieu of fee out of that, that's a way to have a win-win situation for the developer and for the city. The other piece of this that's attractive to me is once you're talking about a dollar fund, your use of that fund is no longer restricted to that development. You now have a pot of money which the city can then use to develop affordable housing on more affordable land of a size and nature that could actually be effective in actually providing more affordable housing. The key to this, though, is how much discretion does the city have in controlling those funds. You wouldn't want that to be too much. You wouldn't want this to end up in the city fund. You'd want to have Arch in there as it is now. But there, or have you seen, this is finally getting to the question, have you seen that sort of development or mechanism used in other cities where you create a pot of money which the city then could then use to fund affordable housing at different levels in the city, separate from the missing middle development?
Oh, sure. Most of the funding from, or most of the projects funded, I guess I would say there are two types of projects in big buckets that the trust fund has supported over the years. And one has been multifamily development. Maybe I'd say three. A second one has been home ownership projects, and for the most part, those have been done by Habitat, and those have been 10 to 20 unit projects. And then a third one is which you might call group homes or special needs housing, and those are typically single family homes in residential neighborhoods.
Thank you. That's what I was hoping to hear. Part of the value of in lieu is you open up the potential for different housing. You can get into multifamily, you can get into group home, you can get into special needs that wouldn't be necessarily available through the typical model related missing middle. Helpful, something I'll be thinking about. I think people around here will be thinking about as well.
Commissioner Olson.
Well, after that last one, I'm not sure I still like this idea as much, but I figure I'll ask. Have these fees been used at all to try and incentivize affordable housing at, say, the 60 and 80% AMI level for smaller developments by offering to take money from this fee in lieu of and use it to pay for things like frontage improvements or the like instead, or that impact fee that would occur otherwise to try and get a development that, say, is only making 4 or 5 units, they could make one of those units affordable instead, for example. I'm just curious if anything like that has been tried. I see some potential downsides, so I figured I'd ask.
I'm sorry, I have my hearing aids in, but I didn't quite make out. what you
You're
were
okay.
saying.
Have there been any instances where the use of those funds have been directed to a developer to pay for impact fees or frontage improvements or something along those lines to try and reduce the developer's cost to allow for the feasibility of construction with a smaller development? Just thinking in Kenmore, where I suspect more likely for missing middle style development between 4 to 8 units perhaps. And given that, going to Commissioner LaSalle's point, if you reduce the overhead cost further by, you know, paying for permit fees or other fees that would normally be paid for by the developer on the whole project. Could that make it more affordable? Has this been tried? Like I said, I see some potential downsides to it, so I just wanted to ask if it's been tried.
I'm still trying to figure out the question, and maybe that's me, but are you asking that, can you collect a fee in lieu and use it to put towards paying for frontage improvements or permit fees or something else? Is that the question? Because if that's not the question, then I'm still unclear.
Kind of. So yes, collect the fee in lieu, but for a developer that is choosing to build an affordable housing unit and they want to make it profitable, but because we have a smaller development, or it's likely to have smaller developments that are clusters of, say, 5 to 10 units and not necessarily 10 or more. And it sounds like to get a developer to build a unit with this model, typically you'd want a development of about 10 units or more. Could you basically take the fee in lieu of and say, okay, in this instance, because you're choosing to build a house, we won't charge you this fee in lieu of, and we'll pay for, say, a frontage improvement or the impact fees that would have been applicable to a house to help offset that so that it's still feasible for that developer. I can see that being tricky, which is why I'm curious if it's been tried, and, you know, potential downsides to that.
I'm not sure the best way to answer that. Can I work on that?
Absolutely. And like I said,
I think in general, what you're trying to find is there a way to have some flexibility for smaller types of development, less than typically 10 units, where it seems to pencil out more? So say if it was for 5 units, is there a way to build in some sort of flexibility, whether it's fees or something else, to make some other aspect of the development more affordable, whether it's sort of leveraging it on frontage or permit fees or something? Is that what you're asking?
yes, that's
Okay.
exactly it. And specifically,
Well, half of it is understanding the question. So I think now that we understand the question, I think that's something we don't have an answer, but understanding the question and figuring out, is there a way for flexibility for those smaller types of development? I think that's something we could, if that was the direction or further to look at, we could take a look at that.
thank you. Yeah, and my intent there is basically, we would see increased density, we would see additional housing, so you still need to pay the impact fees to address utilities and sidewalks and all the like, but instead offsetting that cost onto developers that are not building these units, but directing that towards a smaller development project to still pay those fees, and you're effectively just rerouting money from one piece to another to try and further incentivize. But feel free to get back to me. That's complicated.
Apologies, we got there in the end.
Okay, Commissioner Vanderland and then Commissioner LaSalle.
I think there is an important question there, and it's applicable not just to the affordable housing, but to the general missing middle. Do we want to, is it appropriate to allow or offer compromises, I'll call it, adjustments to single-family set-asides, other design requirements in order to incent something? That would be affordable housing, maybe it would be impervious surfaces reduction. I think that's a discussion we need to have in context of the entire, not just the affordable component, but missing middle in general.
Commissioner LaSalle.
Thanks. I think Commissioner Olson explained it really well, but I think I was really interested in his idea. Yeah, I disagree. I agree. I would also be very interested in understanding what level of additional flexibility we can offer for non-specialized affordable housing developers who might be interested in doing a development, but if they were supported in a way using that in lieu fee kind of pots accumulated through other developments, give them the possibility of still turning a profit, because that's obviously their business model, but converting it into an affordable housing unit for something that normally would have never been that case, because for specialized affordable housing companies, the developers, you would expect them to be focusing on more significant projects and not necessarily onesie twosies. But if we have a non-specialized developer have the ability to convert their housing, their unit or their project into affordable housing and still make it affordable for them because of that extra funding, that would be flexibility, would probably, again, based on the inventory that Kenmore has of mostly being built, of having those conversions could be something I'd be really interested in hearing about as well.
Any other questions? Vice Chair Thompson, go ahead.
I think this one's simple. The fees would stay in, the fees collected would stay in Kenmore.
They can be restricted to Kenmore if that's what you wish. The model of the trust fund is that the money is pooled and that is spent all over the arts sphere, and that over time, and I mean years and years, that it generally works out that the investments within your community come back to you in proportion to how much the community has put in.
And I do very much appreciate that. Unfortunately, the state and the county has now put some requirements on us to meet numbers. So I am a little hesitant to do the pooling if we don't get numbers.
I know what you're getting at. And I'm just one of the people, but, you know, a lot of local staff are working with county staff to make sure that if a community is contributing funds that goes to investment for affordable housing in another community, that you're still getting some kind of credit for that.
Well, that would be wonderful. And then I would have a change of thought as far as what our policy might need to be.
Okay, I have just a few questions and a comment. Number one, I guess I'll say I'm interested in the idea that was generated from down the side of the dais about how we could creatively use fee in lieu to incentivize affordable developments, even if it's not with, you know, that particular unit or development. And then I'm interested in what was the size of the developments in Redmond where we saw them kind of popping up all over the city? Were they all kind of 10 or more units?
Yes, because Redmond has a threshold, or had a threshold of 10 units
Okay.
before that would apply, so.
Okay. And then in these developments, are the materials required, are the materials the same? Like each unit is being built with the same materials? Like there's no cost savings to the developer by them like building the unit with a different standard of materials,
They have to be the same on the exterior.
but not on the interior?
On the interior, they can be, according to the code, they can be built to, I mean, the construction quality has to be the same, but the finishes, the appointments and appliances in some cases can be a lower quality as long as they are determined, basically as long as we agree that they are at least entry-level quality.
Is that something that each jurisdiction can decide for itself, or is that?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And then if, this is just a thought question, if we went with a fee and loop only program, what would the implications for efforts to make our zoning more inclusionary be? Would we be hurting ourselves in that effort? I'm imagining that it could just kind of perpetuate exclusionary zoning patterns of development.
Right, if you allowed every project that would have otherwise had to provide one or more units on site just to pay their way out of it, then you would end up with a lot of, your affordable housing would be provided in dedicated projects for the most part. And you wouldn't have housing in the, scattered throughout the neighborhood as with the development that's occurring.
Mhm. Can you envision a way to make a kind of a creative application of fee in lieu to apply it to our code so that we're, still getting at what inclusionary zoning is intending to?
The easy answer is to just allow them to pay a fee in lieu of a fraction, but not be able to buy their way out of full units. So if their requirement was 2.3, they could pay the fee in lieu of the 0.3, but they'd have to provide the 2 units on site.
But we would still have to have developments of a certain size that would make this affordable or be workable for the developer.
Right.
And you said at 4 units, you're not seeing that.
At 4 units, I don't believe you'll get affordable units on site unless they're, and maybe this is what somebody was alluding to, was that the city contribute funding to fill that gap for that project.
A complicated problem. Okay, I guess that's all for now. I think I saw some other kind of hands pop up. Did I see that? Did anybody have any questions? No. Commissioner Olson, go ahead.
Not a question, just a concern I have with the idea I brought up. I like the idea. The concern I have is if we provide an incentive, how do we ensure that the money's there, so to speak, right? If you're saying, okay, well, we'll effectively pay some fee amount to cover other costs, but nobody else has paid a fee in lieu. This is a hypothetical, obviously. Where does that money come from, right? If you start with $0, you can't just poof half a house of dollars or half a house of fee in lieu in value out of thin air. Or if you have fee in lieus coming in, but more people saying, oh, well, I would like to avoid impact fees or whatever it may be. That's the tricky part to manage with the idea that I brought up, in my opinion, from the more I've been kind of thinking through it. I still think it's worth looking into. Maybe you have like a caveat where it's like a limit too, so that it's canceling out funding in some other way. But that's the tricky part with the idea I brought up, whereas the doing 10 plus units and organizing it that way, you end up with a big pool of money, but you're not forcing people to necessarily, we're not even forcing, but you're not going to end up in a position where you're trying to spend money you don't have. So
I would, as I was listening, I did recall a couple of projects that are similar to what you're thinking of. It's been kind of fortunate situations where you had the same, we're doing 2 different projects within the city. So the developer built 14 units. I don't remember the exact numbers now, but like 15 units on one site, and they were doing another 12 units on another site. And so they had a fraction here of 0.3, and they had a fraction of 0.7 over here. And the city made them pay the fee in lieu here just in case they didn't come through over here. But they did, and so they provided the affordable, they added those fractions together over here and had the unit provided that way. We've had other developers tell us that they would welcome, they were open to making a deal with other developers if to take on their affordable units. You know, I don't know what the terms would have been, but
Commissioner LaSalle?
a lot of possibilities.
Yeah, so big fan of the idea. Would love to see how that is possible. In that context, when you think about modalities to make it happen, one, not issue, I refuse to consider that idea, but one challenge that I would love to hear about is also how that potential pool of money would be allocated, because I can imagine that if it is proactive of the city deciding to reach out to a developer saying, hey, we hear you're developing this, would you be interested in making it affordable with our support? That could be potentially, I would imagine, interesting for a developer, because there would be the certainty of, well, at least that money I don't have to worry about because I know I'm getting it from the city, but it would require the city to be very proactive in that way of working. If it was reactive and developers could apply for this, then we're into the initial issue of, if they start applying it, if someone applies for it and the pool of money isn't there, how do we pay for it? And also, if the pool of money is there, what would be the criteria for saying yes or no for specific projects? Because obviously, if a certain number of affordable housing projects get created in the same area, we could get into the issues of exclusionary zoning, not by design, but kind of almost by mistake. So would love to know more,
Okay,
essentially.
questions. Yeah.
Commissioner Vanderlyn?
No question in my mind that when you think about in lieu of, you end up in a potential moral dilemma. Fortunately, that's what economics does to the world. We could have a very inclusionary policy that would allow folks to buy houses at 80% of AMI, and you could have onesies or twosies of those around. Given Kenmore's level of development, the potential for having units of 10 or larger is very small. So your actual yield, we could be very morally correct on this and feel good about it, but the eventual result is not very much. Whereas if you created a pool of funding that could then be used to build, for instance, multi-family housing at a truly affordable rate, well below 80%, you actually could accomplish something meaningful here in terms of creating a truly affordable housing. So to me, that's the attraction to in lieu of. But you have to accept that's what you're doing, is you're going, but developers don't want to build, take advantage of that to fund something that really has public benefit.
Okay, thank you so much, Mike, for presenting to us and fielding all of our questions.
My pleasure.
Appreciate it.
Well, the next presentation is from Kimberly Horn, but I guess what I'm getting out of this, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, that there is some interest in exploring options a little bit right now for either inclusionary housing or a fee in lieu, and you had questions around those two issues that we need to bring back some options. Is that
Yes,
correct?
I'm seeing lots of nods.
Okay.
So I think that's right. And then before we move on to the next topic, do you have more questions about this part, Debbie?
No,
No,
that's
okay.
all. I just wanted to make sure that there was enough, because, these were individual comments, but I wanted to make sure as a body that you were interested in hearing more of those two options so that we can then continue to work with Mike.
This Commissioner Vanderlyn has a question.
Yeah, as you put together a response typically for the in lieu of, one of the things would be, I think we'd be interested in knowing is from Arch, what is the potential here? What's the state of the art for creating something like a city designated fund? Would sit within the Arch control, but those funds would be set aside for a use that would be defined by the city for projects within the city. Is that doable? Is that something that Arch would be willing to, just what's the state of the art on that?
I mean, that's possible. It's also possible that the city does have, I believe, an affordable housing fund currently that we could then, if fees were collected, put into the city fund and then decide then how to disperse those later. So there are, I guess, many mechanisms for figuring it out, but I think we're still at a higher level right now in figuring out options. And then the mechanics of how and when and what fund and when to give to Arch or would be part of that discussion.
Whether it's sooner or later, having some specifics that we could weigh and maybe give as part of our recommendations to the city council on how this would work. I think that would give people some confidence that this is something that would work. And particularly having the concrete examples or recommendations to give would be helpful.
Okay, and then before we move on, oh, do you have a question, Commissioner? Olson? No, okay, before we move on to the next portion of our agenda, which would be review draft middle housing and ADU regulations, could we take a 5-minute break?
Yep,
Okay.
that would be great. And then we can get the presentation loaded up.
So we'll come back at 8:06. Okay, it's 8:11, so we'll come back to order. Debbie and Todd, would you like to introduce?
Yeah,
Next
I'll
portion?
introduce Nick tonight. Yeah, so you all know Nick Chen from Kimley Horn. He's been with us multiple times throughout the last year and a half or so. So he's brought forward a first draft of the middle housing regulations and as well as a map on the alternative discussion along the Swamp Creek corridor and some additional project examples or photos that he'll also share. So we'll hand it over to Nick.
Yes, good evening, Chair and members of Planning Commission. It's good to see you all again. I think it was maybe less than a month ago we saw you all in a group setting. Since then, we actually don't have a formal presentation for you tonight. I think we've presentationed out of the discussion and kind of gone straight into the draft code. The draft code provided is in the scope of how we described everything maybe a month ago. It's in that phase 1 and phase 2 kind of area where it meets minimum requirements, but it's only just starting, well, it's maybe halfway through being customized for Kenmore. I think that's kind of the rest of the discussion for today is how do we finish customizing it to work for Kenmore. I did get all of everyone's responses, which was super helpful because it allowed me to go through and kind of prep for this. So I think however you'd like to kind of proceed, knowing we don't have a presentation, I can share the couple of things we do have on the screen here, and then we can maybe go from there on questions. I will say right off the bat, the map that's here, I think Chair Banashinsky, you did catch that we omitted some of the R1 parcels accidentally, so that we do need to go back and revise. I think just north of 522, there's some parcels in here that were just accidentally omitted from the GIS data. So those are intended, all R1 parcels were intended to be captured in that. So I think there was a couple of questions on that as well. So, but yeah, maybe we start there and just say on that note, that is the alternative to density approach with the 75-25. The parcels we identified equate out to, if we add some of the ones we missed, probably about 17-18% of the total single family, the R1, R4, and R6 parcels. So it's under that 25% threshold. It doesn't require certification by Commerce. So the way the language is basically written in the code now, in the draft that we provided, is written to where the middle housing requirements and permitted uses, development standards, all those things that we added don't apply to those areas that we identified. So the change there is relatively simple. If you were to add and remove parcels, it would just be a change to the map. And we already are going to work with staff and staff GIS to make sure the map gets updated to be correct when it gets in the final draft. So are there any questions on that, those areas identified, if we need to identify others?
Commissioner LaSalle?
Hey, thanks. Just a clarification for me, because lots of R1s are along Wallace-Swamp Creek, and it's my understanding that there's a fair amount of those that are protected wetlands, and therefore wanted to understand what the impact for conversations we're having now of those protected wetlands. I live on one of those R1 parcels, and my understanding is that therefore part of my lot isn't buildable and therefore is not applied. And so I think that while this map is useful, it also doesn't fully represent the situation of R1s, or at least the ones that are in protected wetlands. Because when we see some of those that are of a significant size, not all of that is buildable, and therefore doesn't really apply to any density increases that we could have with regards to middle housing. So my question is, could we have an updated map which has all the parcels, but also that shows of those R1s and R4s, what is the area actually that we can work with?
Mhm. So currently, any development on those sites, those R1 sites, that you'd have to fall into your existing critical areas ordinance. So the area you're talking about fall into the critical areas you wouldn't be able to develop, or you'd have to develop per the ordinance and the requirements of the ordinance. So the same would still apply to middle housing if we were to include those R1 parcels. The alternative to density approach would exempt the entirety of that R1 parcel to middle housing requirements. You just wouldn't you wouldn't permit duplexes, triplexes, like fourplexes, those types on that parcel in general. And I think the intent from previous discussions has been to kind of limit some of that added unit density on some of the maybe more sensitive parcels that are, and typically tend to be in the R1 area around some of those critical areas. So we could update a map to include the critical areas overlay. And I think we do have the data for where the critical areas fall within the city. And that's what we use to kind of identify some of the R4 parcels as well. But hopefully that answers your question of like, there's a lot of different ways you could slice it. I think all R1s was a clean way to kind of capture that area that we're talking about.
It 100% does, and I appreciate that. I'm just thinking, and I'm going to make up numbers just for the sake of the argument. If 50% of the red R1s that we're seeing here have critical protected areas, then while the map is useful, we're actually not only talking for this conversation about half of those areas. And so I think it'd be interesting to understand what part of those R1s and potentially R4s are actually concerned about possibility around middle housing, because the ones that are in critical protected areas would therefore be taken off the table, if I understand what you just said, probably.
So I think I'm trying to maybe clarify the areas we've identified in the map and the parcels that are not, are R1, but should be identified and aren't. Those would all be exempted from middle housing requirements. They would stay the same way they are now. So you could build single family, but it would be per your critical areas ordinance. It wouldn't be a portion of the lot, or it wouldn't matter if a lot had critical areas or it didn't. If it was R1, it would be removed from middle housing. So hopefully I
Yeah,
understood that
thanks
right.
for clarifying.
Yeah.
I was unclear. It'd be interesting to also see if there's other areas which potentially could be impacted by middle housing,
Sure.
which would therefore be taken off the table because of that, and understanding what the impact of that impact, for lack of a better term, could be.
Yeah, and I think the intent that we went into it with, and I think our understanding from the previous meeting was there are certain kind of wildlife corridors within the city that it's not necessarily all parcels with critical areas or anything, but it's certain wildlife corridors. So that's where we want to make sure we've gotten the correct areas, is that we've highlighted those corridors correctly.
Okay, Commissioner Wilson, and Vice Chair Thompson, and Commissioner Vanderlyn.
I'm pretty sure that I am missing something on this, but I just wanted to ask for my and the rest of the commission's sake. When I was looking at the minimum lot sizes, it looked like R1 had a minimum lot size of, I think it was 2,500 square feet.
Oh.
Yeah, it was pretty small, and I'm assuming that there's some other code somewhere that limits the subdivision of the lots in R1. My concern is, if there isn't some restriction there, and you have reasonable use exemptions for a single detached dwelling unit, and an R1 parcel is split up, that you have additional development regardless on some of those lots where the intent is trying to limit development adjacent to these critical areas. I think I'm probably missing something, so that's why I wanted to ask. Is there anything that would prevent, taking a 50,000 square foot lot and turning it into 25, 2.5?
It's based on density. So to subdivide, if it was R1, then you need 2 acres to create 2 lots. So it doesn't say you divide it by 2,500 square feet. That's not the lot. So whether it's R1, R4, R6, you divide that amount into an acre. So R1 means 1 unit per acre. So you would need 2 acres to be able to subdivide and create 2 lots.
Perfect, okay.
Does that help?
Yeah, no, that's, I figured that was the case, and I just really wanted to make sure that that was explicitly what was happening, because otherwise that seemed like a obvious issue.
Vice Chair Thompson?
Thank you. So looking at the map, if we look down on Sammamish Slough there, to the east of the park, there are a slew, shall we say, of red parcels all the way down. Now, I think some of those are multifamily condos already built, or am I mistaken that location? You know what I'm talking about, folks? If
Yes,
anyone
you're
wants to
talking
help
about
me.
the gray parcels that are on, it looks like they're on Bothaway, but they're actually on 175th. The ones that are south of Bothaway Northeast.
Yeah, that's the group.
Yeah. Yes, there are some, I think, 2 larger complexes of either condos or apartments. And then there are some units that have, or lots that have a single family home on them. I had a question about those as well. I think, Nick, you probably saw that in my packet, and I'm still not really clear about the zoning in that area.
So if I have the area correct, is it the kind of the area that I'm circling right
Yeah,
here?
That's right.
So it's kind of a strange thing on the zoning map. Those parcels have parcel lines, so that's fine. Those are actually zoned R4, right along the street. And then there's a strange kind of split zoning on these lots that's R4, and then closer to the river, the slough area, it becomes R1. So these are exempted on this map because they're R4 and they're not directly abutting. But the R1 portions are exempted on the map. Maybe I can pull up the.
Well, let's just say for a moment that there's in that red area, somehow let's say somebody built already, they're established there. We're working on it here. Yeah, the red, here, yes.
Like right next to the park.
Yeah.
Right, and so what I'm saying is if that is already there, do we need to do some restriction on those lots? Or do we have to do restriction on, if we do a restriction on, well, no, let's just say for the purposes of the environment, do we have to use up those lots in our percentage?
I'm not sure I understand what you mean by use up, but for the development that's already there, it would just stay permitted
Right.
as is. If it's existing non-conforming now, then it would stay that way. If it's permitted now, it would stay permitted. It would just mean that the future development on those parcels would have to, be consistent with your code, but existing development now would stay in place. You wouldn't have to like proactively do anything to those lots or anything.
Commissioner Vanderlyn.
Yeah, just a request for information. The zoning for the lots that are adjacent to the Heron Rookery. What is it? This- On the map.
That's
I
the
couldn't
road
find it.
coming in, so there's the R, yeah, so it's
Downtown commercial.
So if,
yeah.
it's, so if you kind of go along 181st Street, 73rd, and you will, that's kind of where the Montessori school is and where the shelter is, that's downtown commercial. And I believe that the Heron Rookery is on the back side of where that old police precinct is and the new shelter is. So that's kind of that split zone, downtown commercial R1.
Yeah, if you see where the purple and the light yellow meet on the map, that general area to the north of the,
So Nick's got
Yeah,
his
yep.
cursor
that's
whizzing
where,
around
that's
there.
where it's generally located in there.
Any other questions or comments on the map? Did you get the information that you needed from us?
We
Nick?
did, yeah. So I think we'll make the revisions to the map, and then the next time we come before you, you'll have a revised version that you can review and make sure that we've captured all the areas that you're looking. But I think what I heard is we'll just make sure we captured all the R1 areas that, the couple of parcels that were left off. And then the R4 areas identified were the areas that I think you all were thinking of when you kind of gave that direction at the last meeting.
Okay,
Okay,
great, thank
great.
you.
Perfect. I think the largest conversation out of the remainder comments that I saw that we received was sort of around this concept of housing that's consistent with the size and footprint of a single family house, but maybe the current single family zoning is restrictive for middle housing types. And I think a few of you provided responses which helped me kind of understand what the question was that was coming up. So I think there's a couple different approaches the city could take. The current one in there talks about some incentives that would get the city, a little bit of benefit in terms of maybe additional impervious surface because you are doing increased height, but you're maintaining setbacks or something. There's a couple different options you could go. We could go that way. We could also just have different development standards for middle housing types, as long as they weren't more restrictive than what single family provides. So you could have different standards for those that would allow more flexibility with middle housing. So there's a few ways to kind of take a look at that and say, okay, if we think that a 20-foot rear setback currently required for single family is too restrictive for middle housing, then we could lessen that setback. You may want to consider then, I think one of the comments that came back talked about an ADU adjacent to their lot that was, fairly close to the property line, or however close the current city standards require or allow it to be. So there's always those considerations when you think about if we lessen the 20-foot setback to 10, does that currently get somebody closer? Is that something that we want to promote? It does allow flexibility. So it's a good thing in that sense because it can allow you some flexibility in building types and building sizes and just overall development and housing types. So that's a good thing. I personally live where somebody has a rear yard onto me, but it's their side yard, so they're 5 feet from the setback. Never bothered me, but again, it's just it's sort of trying to figure out what those standards would be, and I think it's fairly straightforward, to take it from 20 to 10 or whatever it might be, and we can make those recommendations if that's the direction that you all choose, or you could say, hey, in order to take it from 20 to 10, you also have to make sure that you don't go over a certain height or something like that, as long as you're not, again, making it more restrictive than single family. But there are certain like push and pull type things like we've talked about in the past that could be an option, or you could just say, hey, we want to promote more middle housing, get more flexibility. Let's get these different standards in place for these middle housing types. Could do that as well.
Commissioner Olson?
Thanks for bringing that up. I have had some thoughts about this, so I don't think it's a secret that I personally would be fine with reducing rear setbacks to 5 feet. That being said, I've talked with a number of people in the community, not all of whom agree with me on that. And I want to be respectful of that and try and provide a compromise or a middle ground solution. And so something I would be interested in is seeing for like cottage units and DADUs and things like that, reduced rear setbacks. But I would be curious if the rest of the commission has thoughts on that, but not necessarily for typical middle housing redevelopment or single family housing development. Basically the idea being we already have height restrictions for DADUs and cottage housing style, so we're not going to see a 3 to 4 story house, 5 feet back from someone's property line. But it still opens up people's backyards for DADUs and things like that. So curious if the rest of the commission is interested in that. And then the other one that I saw having to do with setbacks, this is something I just have a question on. So there's a 5-foot setback, side setback, and a total of 15 feet for the side setbacks typically. So it'd be 10 feet and then 5 feet on one side, or 7.5 feet and 7.5 feet, whatever it is. I'm guessing probably 10 and 5 because of driveways. Part of that, however, is a requirement that adjacent to a property, there must be a total of 15 feet between units. Is that due to like fire code or what's that coming from? My concern is you have mirrored lots. So you've got one side where they've got 15 feet between units and they've got the driveway and a 5-foot setback, side setback, whatever. But then the other side has the same thing with another lot. Now you've got a lot in the middle where they have to be 15 feet back on either side, and they get effectively 2 10-foot setbacks on that side because the adjacent units and adjacent lots are only 5 feet from their property line. So it eats in 10 feet on both sides. And now, that middle lot is even more restricted. So I just wanted to see like, what is that coming from? Is it coming from anything, or is it just kind of this arbitrary number that we've created over time? Yeah.
So I'd have to do the research and find the 15-foot building to building setback that I think or separation that you're talking about. I will say, I think typically for single family, it's not necessarily a fire thing because usually you can get hose poles around a single family house and that's not really an issue. So as long as you have access from the street, there's always going to be usually a wall there that would restrict any vehicle from going anyway. So it's typically not going to be enough to be able to have it be a fire type requirement. It's most likely just a building separation for privacy or that kind of thing. I'm not sure on how the city handles when you have the scenario that you described where potentially you have that building separation requirement and 2 lots have developed in a manner that would require, a smaller footprint essentially, but the middle house. So that may be something we would need to look into, how the city handles that kind of unique case.
Yeah, I guess my thought is it didn't seem like anything that wouldn't already be covered by the flexible side setback, if that makes sense, right? You already have to have entry requirements. That's going to almost certainly create a driveway that's 10 feet wide. And you already have the 5-foot setback. So it just seems like something where I don't see why we need it. It just seems like another potential restriction there. But I would be curious if the commission, if anybody else has any thoughts on that in particular. I would find the code, but I was scrolling through my computer to find it, so I'm going to struggle to find it on the iPad. Yeah.
Commissioner Vanderlyn and then Vice Chair Thompson.
I'm not sure if you've already thrown the match onto the fire or I'm about to, but I think this is the point where it could get a little warm. I'll just lead up to a thought here. I think there's a policy decision that we need to address as a commission. And until we get there, I don't think we're going to make a lot of progress on a number of these questions, particularly those having to do with design development standards. As I understand it right now, and I'm prepared to be corrected, the county has established
an estimate of about 1.5 million new inhabitants over the next 20 years. And they've assigned to Kenmore its share of what that is. How that number comes about is a mystery. But what we've seen from the numbers that we've been shown to us, as I read them, is at this point, we have more enough, or certainly enough capacity to meet those requirements over the 20 years. That said, I'm wondering just how aggressive are we really wanting to be in incenting and encouraging new development, whether that's missing middle or ADU? What do we really need to do? My concern here is that once you begin to talk about moving setbacks from 20 feet to 5 feet, you're changing the character of the neighborhood. Now, I believe that, or I'm willing to believe that in 20 years, Kenmore is going to look more like Brooklyn than it does today. And 5-foot setbacks are going to be something that we're just accustomed to, or maybe not. A lot hangs on what's going to happen over the next 20 years. Are we ready to go all the way to a full-scale encouragement of development and changing design standards in anticipation of that? That's a policy question. Clearly, if we do that, we are changing significantly, and I will use the naughty word of neighborhood character when you do this. The quality of life and the way people live will be very different once you start closing up that privacy space between. Are we really ready and willing and wanting to do that right now? Or over the next 20 years, will we have the time to absorb additional information, make course corrections one way or another, to actually be compatible with what reality may actually give us? So that's the question that's going through my mind. And I'm just looking for a discussion and maybe a decision among ourselves about just how critical is it? Do we need to push the panic button now and go to the ultimate? We need to encourage as much development as we can possibly get in anticipation that we're going to need more than what even the county has suggested. Or can we take a more gradual approach to this and allow ourselves to be able to learn and to absorb what the future will actually give us? Chairman.
Would you like to respond to that, Debbie or Todd or Nick, before I move on to the next person?
There's a lot to unpack there.
There was certainly a lot to unpack there, yeah.
Yes, there is sufficient capacity to accommodate growth. The question, though, is more on housing choice. And I think what we're trying to get to is that whatever codes we put in place are feasible to allow that housing choice. So I don't think it's a question of capacity. It's a question of how we accommodate choice. And I think doing that in a way that is compatible with what's built, although we've also heard concerns about the current built environment is currently a lot of large single-family homes on a lot. So unless we do something else, which I've heard there is interest in encouraging either more choice or encouraging a smaller footprint, you will get more of what you have. And I think with the state saying we have to do something different, so that we have to do something to address the state law. And what we're trying to do is come up with something which is reasonable and practical and feasible. There is a need for some sort of change. And I think this is part of that discussion, is what kind of change do we need? That 20-foot setback is arbitrary. That has only been in, and I don't remember when it changed. It has not been in effect since Kenmore Incorporated. I do know that. When it changed, it was one of those things. It was arbitrary, based on we think we need a bigger rear yard setback. It was a number that was just selected. So I think the question then is, if you want small houses on small lot, where do you flex to get that? And where do you flex to incentivize more choice? So I don't think it's a question of capacity.
Okay, Commissioner Vanderlyn has a response, and then we'll move to Commissioner Olson.
Thanks. Thank you, Debbie. I think you stated it well.
don't disagree with anything that you said. I think there is a question here of choice, which is teed up for us by the state legislation, and we need to comply with those rules. Where my thinking is going is, how do you go about complying with that? We can allow diversity of housing choices and types without necessarily making drastic changes to design setback development standards. Really, in my mind, it's a question not of preventing choice, and I think we have to change. There's no question about that. But the question is, what's the pace? How much do we allow? How quickly? And that gets us back into the questions: what are the size setbacks? What are the design requirements? Parking requirements? Impervious surfaces? All of those questions, I think, tend to hinge on our assumption about how much development do we need to have, how quickly. Have different choices in terms of what those can be, but we still need to separately address pace.
Commissioner Olson?
I just want to participate in this conversation, and I agree. I think for me, I'm interested in kind of what's the next incremental step for Kenmore. And that's the reason why I was proposing maybe we adjust it for certain types of development, like DADUs, things that don't impact privacy as much. I think it's interesting you brought up your rear lot and then versus the side lot. The parcel I live on, our rear lot has a 20-foot setback. Our neighbors, it's the side of their lot. So they could build a house and peer into my yard if they want, but I couldn't build a house and peer into their yard. And to me, it seems arbitrary. To me, it's like, okay, why do I effectively have, in some ways, less right to the property we own than my neighbors do? And I don't think I should necessarily completely eliminate those setbacks. I understand why people would want them for privacy. But I also think that if we don't increase the flexibility, this does have the potential to increase the pace of development, to your point. But I don't think the pace of development is very quick to begin with. Frankly, it can be quite slow, especially for the type of housing we're talking about, right? We're not like, unless you have a large number of parcels consolidated, you're not going to see a huge area redeveloped. You're going to see little pieces here and there over time. So I think kind of meeting somewhere in the middle on that, pardon the pun, taking that just next step towards allowing these setbacks or reduced setbacks for specific types of development might make some sense, but not necessarily going wholesale. Yeah, you can go build a 35-foot tall building 5 feet back from a setback. Or the other piece of it for me is I've got a lot of stuff written down about the parking requirements because I personally have a lot of thoughts about parking requirements. And to me, it's about increasing the flexibility such that other priorities that we have can be maintained, whether that's tree canopy, impervious surface area, et cetera. It's not necessarily dramatically increasing density, but just making sure that there's enough flexibility in the code that you can do something with a parcel without having to get an exemption, at which point in time you can't build this versatility or diversity of housing stock. You might allow for it, but the reality is it's not constructible, or it's not feasible to design and build without getting exemptions and variances and whatnot. And that's the other concern I have to it. So I don't think I disagree fundamentally with your point. And I could see it changing neighborhoods over time and the character over time. And so that's the type of thing I want to consider. And that's the reason why I was proposing that initial like olive branch, so to speak. But anyways, that's it.
Vice Chair Thompson?
Thank you. So this is a spoiler, Commissioner Olson. You didn't want to go wholesale. I don't even want to go retail on this. This is a very scary deal because it's not just setbacks are a indicator of something else, which is usually impervious surface. And so number one is my concern is impervious surface. If we increase impervious surface or the coverage of, that's a term that I think you've used in the report, coverage, that of a lot, we are going to change the character of Kenmore as well as risk our environmental assets, whether it be tree canopy, which is probably the big one, other types of environmental items that our community hold very important. Because when we start putting 3 units on some of these acres, they're going to be cutting down probably in most cases quite a few trees in order to meet code for just building those homes. So that was a concern. I think that any change in reducing the setbacks is also going to make our neighborhoods just plainly look different, especially if there are more homes on that property that has the decreased setback from the lot line on the side lot lines. Not sure if that is going to be publicly feasible for us or the council to put forward. I just, from what I see and hear, we've already had issues with certain segments of our community, and we get a lot of pressure from the Home Builders Association on these items, and they've even said that we shouldn't have on the record in front of the council that if they enact a tree ordinance, that they will essentially make Kenmore unbuildable as far as putting missing middle in. I'm just not kidding about that. And there's a big push throughout the state and in King County on this very issue. I'm not even talking about our the red zone here in the map that you have. I mean, and it is true that those are very, those are important lots with regard, that's a whole different matter than I'm talking about right now. There are some things that I think that we can provide some leniency on, but when it comes to coverage of lots, I'm very, very worried.
So could I maybe offer, and I'm not advocating one way or the other, but you could decrease setbacks while still maintaining your same impervious standards. So you would theoretically, you wouldn't allow someone to build any more, like you talked about lot coverage, it's sometimes used in similar terms. Someone wouldn't be able to build more of a lot than they would currently. It's just they could build it in different areas on the lot and allow more flexibility. Now, in practice, there probably are some scenarios where those setbacks on smaller lots currently don't even allow someone to build the max, up to the max impervious. And in that case, you may see more impervious surface because you've now relaxed some of that and allowed development on other parts of the lot. But in theory, with the way the code is written, you could keep your impervious surface requirements the same and just change where a lot could be located, which could allow maybe a little bit more building separation between, your duplex and your single family house or whatever the different housing types on the lot might be.
I want to assure
Commissioner Olson that I will not build a house close enough to look into his living room, bedroom,
I'm
or
sure he would
shower.
appreciate that.
You were worried about that.
I'm wondering if it would make sense for us to ground our conversation in the table and that you provided for us, Nick. You were talking in that table in the memo about neighborhood benefits and then what that might look like. I'm wondering if if we can talk about what neighborhood benefits we would like to see, which I feel like translates into our values, if that would help us give you direction about what kind of code we want to see. Debbie, it looks like you also are having a
No,
thought. Would you like?
I'm trying to figure out a way here, being as, at some point, we are going to have to move forward in
Yeah.
developing a code.
Yes.
And it's like, these kind of higher level discussions are great, but I think we now need to actually figure out how to translate those into code. So I think in the briefing memo, Nick did provide some questions, and I think what we're really looking for is how to address those questions so that we can bring back a code. We're to that, you've been wanting to jump into this for a long time, and we're at that point right now. So I think, Commissioner Banashinsky, that's a great idea.
And so really a lot of these can be boiled down to what we've been talking about, some of the development standards, and that really is how you create some flexibility. It's the question we have for you is, what are the more important things that you want to see, right? Do you want us to bring a code forward that relaxes some of these standards to be able to create opportunity for middle housing, or do you want to keep it within kind of a similar envelope that currently exists for single family and keep consistent with a lot of the bulk standards that currently exist? Like that's sort of the question we have right now, is we can write the code either way and both are consistent with state law, but we need some direction on whether we are creating requirements specific for middle housing that are going to promote middle housing and allow more flexibility, or are we looking to stay more along the kind of state minimum definition that's required for the city to be in compliance? And so in the table, we did talk about, increased heights. If you wanted to see maybe allowing someone to go an extra story above what's currently allowed, if they were to stick within a smaller building footprint, you could have some of those trade-offs. Similar, you could decrease setbacks and require a lower building height if that was a concern. That would allow more buildable area. You would have to then take a look at impervious surfaces, but we could adjust all those things and bring that code before you. We just kind of need to know what's most important when we're making some of these adjustments.
I'm going to go with Commissioner LaSalle, Commissioner Vanderlyn, and then Commissioner Olson.
Yeah, so for me, in trying to convert this to code, I shared some of these thoughts in prior meetings, but what I feel is really important, what I would want to avoid is just expanding sprawl on existing lots. And for me, the key consideration is how can we turn the existing built inventory of Kenmore into more middle housing compatible configurations. And you just mentioned elevated opportunities of building on top. For me, at least, what I really would like to see is how can we encourage building higher, not building wider, to save as much possible the green spaces that we have, both from a parks perspective, of course, but more importantly, within existing lots, to not turn every lot that might have some greenery into parking lots. That would be my main focus of understanding how we can do that conversion, because I think it's more conversion than a net new construction situation. And it feels to me that doing so, building upwards rather than sideways, is the way to go.
Commissioner Vanderlyn.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought there was somebody before me. So my match is still lit, so I'll throw it onto a new bonfire here. Starting with number one, footprint of a single family home. I think that for an opening salvo, dipping our foot into this is the way to go. The objective here would be to minimize the impact on our current single family neighborhoods. But at the same time, understanding that we do need to be able to have some flexibility that would allow the development of alternative middle housing. I think that's something we could do within the current footprint of a single family. I would prefer to see us start there, understanding that we're going to come back and look at this again probably every year. Long time. Sorry, Debbie. All right, every 3 years. How's that? I'll be gone by then, so you guys can have it by then. But that's where I would put down my initial thought here. And I think that will allow us to be able to do, as I say, to go into this gradually, to be able to learn and see what the environment really and what the market is really going to give us. The last thing that I'll be quiet on the subject is the one thing that I keep going back in my mind is understanding the development of missing middle housing is a profitable venture. It is a for-profit venture. Start talking about incentives. Why? Why do we need to make it easier, more profitable for developers when it may actually be degrading the quality of life in our town? We need to find out. If we need more density, let's make our first step to that, but let's take this as it comes so we can do some reason. Other piece I'll just throw out here that's related is, and I put it earlier to Todd and to Debbie, is I'm really become confused about what is once you get into missing middle, once you get into building basically for-profit developments that are going to be financed separately, that are going to be either on unit lots so that they're freestanding, they're saleable individually. What's the difference between a detached ADU, an ADU, and a single family? None. So why would we have differentiation in terms of the way they're taxed, the way the design requirements are? Why would those need to be different if they are essentially the same? They are for profit. We're not in the affordable housing piece here. I'll stop there.
Commissioner Olson?
Yeah, first thing I'll say, I completely agree with keeping the size of building similar. I have no issue with bulk building requirements, like how big the building should be, and making sure it's not longer than a certain length. But I believe that's always been the intent from what I've seen, is it's within the same general footprint, and that's no different, right? So when I'm talking about adjusting setbacks, it is more not when and I guess this is a piece of just clarification that I would like to point out. When I say incentives, I think it comes off as I'm trying to say, oh, well, I want to provide a financial allowance for this, but really what I'm saying is I want there to be enough flexibility in the code that we are not actively precluding something while turning around and saying, oh, well, we allow it. Why aren't you building it? And it's like, well, not really, because we also don't want you to cut down a tree. We also don't want you to build up too tall. You put in all those restrictions at once. And the reality is you can't build it despite the fact that it might not be any bigger. Well, not might, won't be any bigger than an equivalent single family house. So that's my concern there, is allowing it in name only, but not actually allowing it to be constructed or built or implemented in a meaningful way. But I 100% agree with having bulk sizing requirements where new missing middle development should not be bigger than an equivalent single family sized lot. And that would mean most likely smaller units and the like. That being said, I do have other concerns that come from that. For instance, if we have similar parking requirements, the reality of the matter is the proportion of your building and your built area that goes to parking for a missing middle development, if we have a parking minimum that is 2 spaces per unit, and you have a fourplex versus a single family house, well, you have to build 8 parking spaces versus 2. That's about $140,000 to $160,000 in land alone for parking. So when I'm looking at a allowances, I'm more looking at that. It's like, what can we do to make sure that building missing middle is not any more restrictive than building a single family house? But at the same time, we don't, I don't necessarily want them to build a 45-foot tall building so that they can put in 8 units of parking. I would rather see 4 spaces of parking instead, or something along those lines, and the building size is the same and the individual units are a bit smaller. Or instead of cutting down a tree, they push back a ways, but the overall impervious surface area requirements and the rest are the same. So I'll just say 100% agree with building size, and bulk size should not be a larger footprint for missing middle housing than for single family housing. Yeah.
So Commissioner Macias and then Vice Chair Thompson.
I have a question, then I'll probably comment back. Just to clarify, the current guidance from Commerce is tailored at continuing with same footprint, same size. Is that what Commerce is recommending at this point? And then options to tailor?
That is the minimum requirement that Commerce has set out, and then you can tailor from there. Yeah, I don't know if it's necessarily a recommendation or what
Okay.
they're looking for, but yeah, that is the minimum requirement that you have to meet, is that you at least keep the same kind of bulk standards that you have for single family.
Okay. I think where I'm at this point is I would like to see code that keeps that bulk standard in single family footprint. And then, I think the point for me is it's really hard to know whether we need to reduce the rear setbacks, because I don't know if we have data that tells us, are we not allowing DADUs because of this? I don't know if we have any data that tells us that we are or are not. And I think there's still levers to pull, right? When we go down the road and have options to look at this later on. I think that's just where I'm going. I really like code directed to perhaps stacked flats and ADUs to try to maintain those buildings and maintain that space. I really liked that idea of trying to take an existing home and turn it into a stacked flat and middle housing. I think that kind of gets us where we want in all places. So that's just kind of where I would like to see the code, and start there. And then, okay, do we need to ratchet it up or down?
And so the draft code we provided is kind of along those lines. It does go, basically defaults to a lot of the single family standards that are currently there. So it is a good indicator maybe of what that code would look like if, once we were to finalize it. It's a good draft that has that kind of consistency. And I did see your note, and I think once you make, stack flats of permitted use in that zone, then you could look at, what are the requirements for taking a 2-story house and making it into stack flats. And you just have to provide probably separate, you could use some sort of subdivision to provide separate ownership opportunities and then entryways and that kind of stuff. But there are pathways to getting, once you allow that unit, that housing type, there are pathways to getting to there.
Vice Chair Thompson.
On the way to my point, I feel with you on that ADU idea and where we need to go on that, because I think that's meaningful to our community. The other one point before I go to the main point, and that is, if we're going to build affordable or a bunch of units, either way, we need to really consider the concept that we're going to put them more down in the by 522, and then look at the existing lots everywhere else and deal with that. Another point that I like to go back to the code, and my code question for the staff is, are we expected to be really doing anything to these subdivision parts of the code? Or are they just there because we have to look at it all? Meaning you have to print it and put it in the actual ordinance.
Where we're going with this is, obviously, when you make a change to one code, you have to make sure it's consistent throughout all codes. So there may be a need to make changes, not just in the zoning code, but in the subdivision code and other codes. So that's why the packet was big. So I think to get back, Chair, to where you were originally, which was, can we share this screen and some of the questions that we're asking, and think about that in light of also the feedback that you've currently provided, to see if there's maybe some consensus on direction on some of these issues.
Well, on the code, there's, I have a question. There's the term dimensions, and I wanted to understand when it says dimensions in the code, and we're not talking about buildings, I assume, are we talking about the dimensions of the lot, or what? When I look through the code and see the word dimensions, what should I be thinking technically?
I think it depends on the context of where you're seeing it. It could very well mean dimensions of the lot. It could mean, is it in the permitted, or sorry, in the development standards table?
It's in, on page 2, let's see, it's in, I think it's in 080 or 070, because I put a note there. My comments sometimes move around a bit, but it was in that part. So I think you answered my question. I'm satisfied with that.
Okay, and then I'm sorry, Vice Chair, are you,
Well, I
you
just
done?
wanted to get us back to the code, and
yeah,
so that we, as the staff asked, we should be looking at code issues.
yes, and with that, I know I directed us to the table, but I'm actually wondering if in association with that, we could go through the list of discussion questions that you provided, Nick, and make sure that we've answered those for you. I think we've answered number 2.
But yeah, to clarify number 2. I think we've actually answered number 1 as well. It does sound like, and please confirm for me.
Yes, I do. I think I do. I know a number of people spoke on footprint, but I want to give an opportunity to those who maybe haven't, or those who didn't fully express their opinions about it to do so. I think most people did, but is there anybody else who wants to speak to their ideas about footprint? No, okay. Oh, go ahead, Commissioner Olson, go ahead.
So I think I spoke to footprint well when I'm discussing missing middle housing, so duplexes and single family, single detached housing. What I would say is I view the difference between a DADU and a single detached house is size and bulk, right? And so I think this table, if we go up a little bit, it talks about potentially having different setbacks based off the number of stories. And effectively, that's kind of how I see it, is if you have a smaller unit, but that's feasible for a particular context, say a DADU in the back of someone's yard, that is most likely not going to be a person going in to make a bunch of money. They're not maximizing the value of the land by building as much as they possibly can. And so that's, I think the distinction for me is the context in which this type of housing is created and how this housing gets used. Eventually, if it becomes condoized and sold off, I don't see it as really any different effectively from a tax perspective. And it should be treated the same way at that point in time. But otherwise, it's an improved value. And that tax is assessed and applied to the house. And so footprint of a single family home, I really think the footprint depends on what are we seeing. And so at the maximum footprint I would like is current single family housing bulk standards, because I already think those are quite large generally in what we allow today. And potentially smaller footprints for exceptions closer to lot lines, but not necessarily ruling them out entirely, which is what I see in the code right now. So I just wanted to speak to that before I hold my piece.
All right, so I feel like I'm going to try to sum up what I feel like I'm hearing, and then people can tell me if I didn't get it right. So I'm hearing pretty broad consensus for the idea that we're thinking about footprint as about what we're doing for single family housing right now. I personally, I know I shared this already with you in my notes, but I'll just say it out loud for the whole commission. I am also thinking in that direction, but I am thinking that some types might be smaller. Cottage housing, for example, is going to have a smaller footprint than a current single-family home. Duplexes feels like they could maybe be about the same. But then something like a fourplex, I don't know, would it need to be a little tiny bit different? I don't know. And I guess what I am thinking about in terms of footprint personally is like a range that is maybe that goes on the low end to smaller and on the high end, either the same or maybe a little bit different. And I'm saying this because I feel like current zoning has dictated what we see right now. And if we don't allow for any differences in code for these different housing types, I fear we will not see them. So I feel like we might have to develop code that is specific to each type within these size restrictions that we have in mind. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. I will say on the slightly smaller side, we just have to make sure that, again, it's not more restricted than single family. So it's tough to go on the slightly smaller side. You could, if you say for fourplexes or you know, townhouses of a certain number of units, if you wanted to have a larger building footprint to better allow those some flexibility in actually getting those developed, you could go through there because that's just allowing more flexibility and more ability to develop those. So that's fine. We just can't say, hey, if you're going to build a duplex, it's a smaller building footprint, whether that's through setbacks or impervious surfaces or anything like that. We can't make it more restricted than single family currently. So you could make it the same, like we've been talking about. So that's the only sort of wrinkle in what I think I just heard you express.
But then how would you build, a developer couldn't build a cottage house, for example, at the same size?
So you could, the cottage code is a little bit separate and there's, I think I did see some questions on there. There's more flexibility in maybe the cottage code requirements because you could, again, I guess what I'm trying to say is the building footprint for a current impervious surface and setbacks and things creates a certain envelope to build within. And the cottage housing units, just the nature of cottage housing units and allowing more of them is gonna dictate a smaller building footprint, but still within that envelope. We just can't require that envelope be smaller for certain housing types. But because of the nature of cottage housing and how it gets developed and some of the open space requirements and those types of things, it's gonna naturally be smaller, even if that building envelope is still the same. When you have different kind of open space requirements, it changes the nature. And that's why cottage housing is kind of unique out of all the housing types that are in here. And it's why it has a kind of separate portion of its code that we added in. We added sort of a light version of it just to get a sense for what it could look like. But you could look at any number of codes that do have cottage housing currently. There are more restrictions in terms of open space, in terms of access, in terms of required sidewalks and common spaces and those types of things that could be put into a cottage housing code that we can certainly add in for those.
Okay, so in sum, I heard footprint the same. Commissioner Olson.
Yeah, something that Bothell has for their apartment buildings is a literal length, maximum length that the apartment buildings are allowed to be on any axis and dimension. I believe they also have a maximum like top-down square footage. And for me, I think basically for single family, duplex, triplex, quad, I don't see why we can't just have a maximum dimension on those parcels to ensure that the sense of scale, the size of the buildings feel about the same, but we allow for that size of building to convert, whether that's taking a single family and making a stacked flat from it or whatever else. The only exception or challenge I see is for DADUs that are smaller detached units. I see those having similar challenges to the cottage housing developments and row homes and that type of thing, where they're all next to each other, and then potentially having that maximum dimension might be something that you want to change, but that really only begins to matter once you're looking at a larger development anyways. But I think for the other developments, I would be interested in just like very explicitly having maximum dimensions on building size. But I don't know, staff, please shoot me down if that's a bad plan.
I will say it's somewhat rare and it can potentially be pretty restricted to have standards like that. I could see maybe if it was a percentage of the overall lot, say, but then you start to get into the same basic territory as setbacks in general. You're kind of restricting what that length is. I'm not personally too familiar because there are not very many cities that have maximum building lengths. There are some cities, and say in a downtown context, that will say a certain facade can only be, 50 feet wide so that you don't get these mass, blank facades and that kind of thing. But that's separate from what we're talking about with single family. So not familiar with that. I don't know, just off the, just thinking about it in the context right now, that I would really recommend something like that, or really that it's necessarily, you're going to see a lot of it with these types of housing that we're talking about, because they're not these large building type things. They're generally going to be smaller with duplexes and triplexes and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I suppose that was kind of my thought, is we could look at some examples of larger single family houses in the area. And from that, basically say, okay, typically 75 feet by 75 feet is excessive, but if you're within that kind of shape, some shape within that, you're going to be inclusive of other building types. That being said, I see it being challenging with odd shaped lots or other things like that, where, then you start getting into the need for variances and whatnot, and potentially limit the point of it by, if you make it too expansive, then you kind of defeat the purpose. So
Yeah, I think it's sort of just a different way to get to like your same building envelope that you create with setbacks.
Yeah.
Commissioner Vanderlyn?
Okay, if I move us to number 5?
Not quite yet. I have one question before I move on. So given the direction that we just gave about footprint, what are the implications of that in your planner mind? Can you see, like, are we going to be, will we be able to promote a variety of housing types in our community given that decision, or will we be restricting ourselves?
I think it kind of goes back to what Commissioner Macias was saying of there's an approach you can take where you say, we're going to put these standards in place and see what happens over the next couple of years. We're consistent, consistent with what state law requires. If we see a lot of housing get built, then we know that our requirements aren't too restrictive. If we don't, if we're not seeing that, you have to pick some sort of metric to evaluate it. But if you're not seeing that type of housing getting built, then maybe we start to look at, we'll say 3 years from now versus 1 year. But at some point you will say, okay, are there adjustments we want to make, again, still consistent with state law, that would further allow or maybe make it more feasible to develop some of these housing types. So that's one approach you could take. Other than that, because there's so many different lot sizes and those types of things, it's really tough to say whether, decreasing a setback, a rear yard setback is going to make it that much more feasible than keeping it at the current single family one.
Okay, so let's move to question 4, which is development incentives / neighborhood benefits. Which benefits would you like to see standards / incentives for? Commissioner Vanderlyn?
I was going to speak on 5, but
Oh.
as long as you've given it to me, I would just reiterate what I said earlier, which is clearer about what we mean by incentives and what are the community benefits that would be gained offering those incentives. I said earlier, building missing middle and profit venture. So I don't see that through any financial or other concessions, additional building. If it doesn't make economic sense, it's not going to happen. So I don't see us putting city resources, taxpayer money, into making a project that isn't otherwise profitable. Exception to that, and I think you get into back up to number 3 again, is what is there or are there particular community like to incent? And I think that's a discussion we need.
I think that is the kind of the question you want to ask, rather than saying what incentives are we giving to a developer or something like that, is what do you want to see as a community and as a planning commission? And then there are certain things, like if you say impervious surface is really important to you, you could say, we're gonna lower your max impervious surface so you can't build it quite as big of an area and you have to leave more area undisturbed, but in order to do that, you get an extra story and you can go up, additional height and get the square footage that you need to make a project feasible. There are those types of things, but again, so as long as the base requirement is still kind of consistent, where someone has the ability to build in the existing, and these other options are just a separate side table of, well, if we want to get an extra story, we're going to realize that, okay, we're going to have to decrease our building footprint and have less of an impact. It's sort of, what do you want to see as a community versus what is a developer going to get?
Yes, so I would really like it if we could ground our conversation in just that question. What do we want to see? Think about the second column, the neighborhood benefits. I feel like that it would be helpful for us to talk about. And I think I saw Commissioner Olson wanted to say something.
Yeah, it's related to this topic exactly. That's how I view incentives, is not what do we do for the developer, but what do we do so that what we want gets built. And for me, I would be open to reducing impervious surface area maximums, but allowing for more flexibility and setbacks. I would be open to making sure that we have more strict tree requirements or maximums along those lines. But as part of that, I think you'd have to be more flexible in setbacks and the like in order to preserve those features. So you're allowing for things to be built, but you're not necessarily saying, like basically what I'm trying to get at is, if you build a duplex that's the same size as the existing single family house on an adjacent lot, but they would either have to build it pushing back a setback or cut down a tree. I would rather they push back the setback than cut down the tree, right? And that's the type of incentive that I care about. Or if, because of the location of the drive aisle, that in order to minimize the impervious surface area, they need to push the setback back. I would rather see the setback reduced so that we can meet that impervious surface area requirement instead. That's the type of thing I'm interested in. On this note, I personally looked through the parking requirements, and I would like to see the minimums reduced and perhaps maybe a preference where we say we would like 2 parking spaces in these areas, but we don't require it. And instead we lower the impervious surface area and those types of things, because I see that being pretty restrictive. And it's not any more restrictive technically than single family housing. But what I see it doing is, for missing middle housing, we will be a lot more likely to see those impervious surface areas increase, or we'll see housing sizes decrease to make up for the parking requirements that we're putting in place, especially in areas that are further away from transit than a half-mile walk shed. So for me, I would say reducing parking requirements, or reducing parking minimums, sorry, doesn't mean people can't build more parking or developers can't build more parking if they want to, but make it more difficult for them to increase impervious surface area. So reduce impervious surface areas, reduce parking minimums, and maybe not blanket get rid of setback requirements, but perhaps have some flexibility. And if you can demonstrate that adjusting a setback will let you avoid cutting down a tree or reduce impervious surface area, making it some way in the code so they don't have to go and get a variance to do that. They just have to show this, this is why we're doing this, without having to, go through an extra hoop, so to speak, that really only applies to this type of housing.
And I think if we understand sort of that right column where you talked about impervious surfaces and parking, if we understand those things, then we can tailor that, whatever that flexibility is needed to create that kind of thing. Because it's not that decreasing setbacks is going to work to help offset everything. It needs to be consistent and kind of show there's a relationship between the two. But we can bring back sort of what those would be.
Yeah, I think that's a key piece of it that I probably have not been emphasizing enough. But the relationship between the two, I think, is really important, because otherwise, yeah, it just becomes a development incentive that is going to make people money, because you can cut down the trees and build more, right? And I see that as a genuine concern that I understand from my fellow commissioners, so I want to be clear on that.
Vice Chair Thompson.
Going to push my button. Okay, so I do agree that there should be a proportional impact method developed. I don't have a problem with that. I am not exactly sure what the requirements for ADUs and DADUs are with regard to the building requirements in order for them to qualify in what we're talking about right now as actually able to be a separate unit. So I'm maybe just ignorant on that, but I would like a little clarity. It could be a little paragraph or something would be fine. What about the whole concept of FAR? Is there, I don't want to give Debbie or Todd a heart attack, but when we're talking about these size of lots, is it a better way or possible way of looking at it by establishing a FAR with the concept of what the size of the lot is and the thought of going up instead of out, or a bigger surface area for coverage? I don't know. And so I just wanted to put that out there as a possibility. And this whole parking aspect has been thrown around in the legislature and locally, and I'm not exactly sure. We were supposed to go down to a half a space within so many, a quarter mile, half mile
It's no parking requirement within a half mile.
within a half mile of the bus routes. So I don't know why we're having a huge discussion about parking spaces and what we're going to go about doing with that. And I do believe we should start looking at the code for specifics here sometime soon.
Okay, we're going to let people answer the rest of the questions and then we'll move on to the code. So does anybody have any other comments about the neighborhood benefits that they would like to see in the code that is brought back to us? Commissioner Macias.
I would like to see the option for decreased parking for the cottage housing. I think you initially brought us there's some pretty defined parking definitions in this draft code. So I think the incentive on that would be worthwhile seeing, and that could potentially open up the open space and more common space. And I do like that option. I think that's a good alternative. Other than that, that's kind of where I'm at on those.
Commissioner Vanderlyn.
Yes, related to discussion question 3, I would suggest that we go away from eliminate this 35 height limit for ADU. Instead, we find that with the idea that we're looking for an incentive here for other things. So you could have the option of going up to, we don't have to specify 35 feet, but you could get additional height in exchange for producing a public benefit. But we take that 35-foot just off of there. Then be consistent with everything else, which says that the height limit would be the same as a single-family house.
Okay, other thoughts from commissioners on, I did skip question number 3. Do other commissioners have thoughts about the building height? We were asked if we wanted to keep a 30-foot height limit for ADUs or if we wanted to lower it. Lowering it could potentially be a benefit for building some middle housing types over ADUs. Any direction there? Commissioner Macias?
It's a limit, right? So we could go lower than that. I'd like to keep that at 35 feet. I think that's a good, I mean, again, that fits within footprint.
I have no issues keeping that. I wanted to second the reduction in parking requirements for cottage housing. I would also be interested in seeing a reduction in the parking requirements for missing middle housing period outside of that half-mile zone. It looks like it goes from potentially, I think it's within a quarter mile, it's 0. And then I think our code kind of has something from a quarter to a half mile where I think it's like one parking space per unit. And then beyond that, it's 2 parking spaces per unit. And I would rather see the minimum be 1 or less, because I know developers will still build parking, even if they will likely build more than one unit space. But if there's a particular lot, I don't want parking to be a thing that prevents development or requires additional impervious surface area is my concern there.
Yeah.
But I think 1 is probably a reasonable compromise for areas that don't have transit access.
Yeah, so just a quick clarification on the parking requirements, consistent with, again, what's in House Bill 1110. There's 0 you can't require parking within half mile of a major transit stop. And then outside of that, it's not like another half mile or quarter mile, anything like that. It's based on lot size. So whether you're below or above 6,000 square feet, if it's below 6,000 square feet, you can only require 1 parking space. If it's above 6,000, you can only require up to 2. You could, as a city, decide to require less on different lots, or you could create a scenario where there were less required if somebody did something else. Again, those are the kind of the trade-offs we're talking about, but that's just a requirement. That's what's in the draft code that we provided, is sort of those different levels.
Sorry, just responding to that. That was kind of my intent. Is I don't see an issue with having 2 required spaces for a single family house, but for middle housing and that style of development where we're saying it has to be in the same footprint. If you have a duplex and it's in the same footprint as a single family house, then if we require 2 spaces, that's 4 parking spaces. And right now I believe we're requiring 2 for outside that limit. So I'd rather see that go down to, 1 space, assuming 1 car per household. If a developer wants to build more or an individual wants to add a parking space, they can go through the process to figure that out. But I'd rather add some flexibility in the code there and but also acknowledge the fact that people will need parking until there's adequate transit and the like. So
yeah, we could look at parking as one of the standards to have a base standard for, and then look at options for what, having a lower standard for that would mean.
Okay, so I heard 2 people say that they wanted to keep the 30-foot height limit for ADUs. I want to see if you agree? Okay. I'm trying to get a quick answer to question. I'm trying to get an answer to question 3 about keeping a 30-foot height limit for ADUs. I heard now 3 people say yes. Do we have you're nodding? Okay, so that's at least 4. So that's direction on that.
Yeah.
Okay, and then for the neighborhood benefits question 4, I think everybody spoke to that. Okay, so I want to put in that I would like to see standards created for tree retention and green space to minimize impervious surfaces, to facilitate the creation of all middle housing types we allow, given that the lot characteristics will allow any given type, like the lot will ultimately indicate what can be built or not. And for flexibility for current homeowners to modify their properties to make them useful over different life stages and changes during their ownership. So those were the things that I personally would like to see as neighborhood benefits in the code. Okay, let's move on to number 5 then. Commissioner Vanderlyn.
Clarify what our direction is again on the 80 height.
Keeping a 30-foot 5 height limit.
Okay, so we're going to allow a higher limit.
I think that's consistent with your current single family. I think it's 35 feet right now.
Oh, I thought it was less than that.
No.
I think it's the same.
Most jurisdictions allow a 24-foot height limit for ADUs, which is lower than a single family unit. But
I understand.
Kenmore's special.
Single family was 24.
Yeah.
35.
I checked. It's 35 and then actually in R6, in some scenarios, under certain conditions, you can go to 45, but it's
Okay.
base 35.
Yeah, so let's move on to question number 5 then about impact fees for middle housing types. What impact fees would the city assess to middle housing? SB 5258 requires the jurisdictions adopt a fee schedule that reflects the proportionate impact of new, smaller housing units based on a few methods. So Nick, can you crack this open a little bit more for us?
Sure. Yeah, this is less of a what's going to be in the code thing and more of a what is the city going to need to, how is the city going to assess impact fees? We've had a lot of discussion about what the difference between ADUs and middle housing units are when in practice and why someone would pick one over the other. And I think our memo had a table that kind of made a comparison between the two as well in response to that. And it's just another one of those things where state law has a requirement for ADUs that you can't charge more than 50% of what the principal unit would be. I think I remember there are no impact fees for ADUs, if I recall, currently. So if you create a scenario where middle housing has impact fees required, that may be enough for someone to say, I'm going to build an ADU versus one of these middle housing types. And so that's kind of the discussion that we were hoping to get an answer on. Again, it's not necessarily going to be reflected in the code. It's going to be in the city's overall fee table of how they assess impact fees. And once you create the middle housing types, there then needs to be some sort of decision made on how the impact fees get assessed.
Okay, before I open this up, can I ask a question? So I had the impression, and it may have been erroneous, that we're not able to make recommendations on impact fees. Did I misunderstand a kind of comment that we heard last time from staff?
I think you can kind of give direction, but how that's incorporated then would be when we update the impact fees. So the transportation impact fees were updated in 2022, and we checked with the city engineer that what was adopted would be in compliance with this current state law. The park impact fees will likely be adopted next year, so that would then be, we'd have to update it then consistent with state law. But I guess the direction then or policy discussion would be, should ADUs continue to be exempt? That's really where we are. So if you have a thought on that, you can kind of give some thought on that to the council when they do update the impact fees, either to retain it or do something different.
Vice Chair Thompson?
If it's a complete, livable, separate unit, and that it's in the same lot, and it's going to be counted as a missing middle and a separate unit, then I think that the impact fee would be half the of a normal home in that lot. So, because I think if we don't do stuff like that, what they're going to do is people will do is build ADUs in their backyard or whatever, depending on what the code is, and then rent it out as a moneymaker. And if that's going to be the case, then they should pay the freight. And we can look at what is defined as I'll call it a separate ADU that is rentable. One of the reasons I asked about kitchens and all of those items, what actually makes a separate dwelling that can be sold as a dwelling. So anyway, that's where I come down on. Back to the old days when it was just for grandma, and the grandma was wandering back into the house for dinner. I see that differently.
Commissioner Olson?
I have mixed feelings on this one, being completely transparent here. My concern with putting impact fees on ADUs and DADUs. I think it's really more ADUs in many ways than DADUs. If, for example, someone bought a single family house and that single family house, detached single family house, paid, it was new construction, built in 2024, let's say, and it paid the TIF and the park impact fees. And then that property owner decides to divide half of their house and turn it into an ADU with the downstairs. Are we making them pay for the entire house and then again for half the unit? And so effectively you get two smaller units that are 3/4 the price in terms of impact fees.
Is that a duplex?
Well, it's effectively a duplex, right? At that point, in many ways. And so my concern there is that disincentivizes people from making that transition for an ADU. For a DADU, I think it's a different story. I think we could go based off of perhaps unit, lot size or something, or sorry, square footage of the unit or something along those lines. And if the typical square footage of a single family house is 3,000 square feet and DADU is about 1,000 square feet, make it a third or whatever that is, and you scale the fees off of that. The other question I have or I guess those last things I said are
And I
statements.
am open to compromise on my,
Okay.
so I just want to be clear.
As am I. I personally think if we don't have impact fees, I think what you're saying is a valid concern. I also don't want to disincentivize it so much that it isn't feasible. I believe that utility costs and utility connections, that's completely separate from impact fees, correct? Okay, so that's the other piece to this is it's often easier to make an ADU without increasing utility sizes because the number of fixtures and things like that don't change. So you don't necessarily need a new sewer line or water pipe or those types of things. But if you're adding a DADU onto that, oftentimes then you also have the additional cost already of putting in additional utility connections, a larger water pipe, larger sewer pipe, electricity improvements and things like that. And so that's the other piece to this, where while I'm open to adding impact fees on this for people building this in their backyards, that can become very quickly now you've got utility improvements, impact fees, and the cost of building this new structure. I'll use my family as an example. I've got a younger brother who is on the spectrum, and we are looking at getting a DADU so that my parents can have their own space, but we can also keep him close by and make sure he has a place to live. We would have to increase utility sizes. We're maxed out on what we could do. So that's already an issue. On the other hand, if we built this DADU and then sold the place and got the improved assessment value and didn't pay any impact fees, that's a problem. So I'm open to some sort of fees on this. I'm not sure I'd want like 50%. I'm not
I think-
sure what the line is, but.
We can look, I would need to look into a little bit more about how this would fully work in practice, but I think what I hear you saying is there's a difference between, whether it's attached or detached, there's a difference between adding square footage and adding an 80 or adding another dwelling unit versus conversion of existing space. And so really what you're looking at is you don't necessarily want to apply impact fees to someone a second time if they're just converting existing space. But potentially if someone's adding square footage that would be leasable or whatever it might be, that's where you're talking about having it. So we could look into something like that.
Commissioner Vanderlyn.
Totally sensitive to your situation. But I want to go back to what I said earlier, which is talking about individually owned, whether it's attached ADU, whether it's part of the original building or as a single family, it's the same thing. And this is a business for profit. So again, I don't see how, unless we want to incent more of these building, why we need to be putting public dollars to support it. I think a situation where you've got a unit that's being sale or as a rental unit, again, for profit, that has the same responsibility, other building to cover the costs. So I think at that point, a proportional impact fee that takes into account, just as yes, for smaller size units, that's perfectly appropriate. I think we can do that. The other part of this too is we're kind of talking around it, but I think we need to be clear when we go through here. We often talk about ADUs, then we talk about missing middle. Aren't they the same thing, or when are they the same thing? So I want to be clear that all of the 1 through 5 that we've gone through, aren't they really applicable to both what we think about as missing middle in 1110 and ADUs, whether they're attached or not? And shouldn't they be the same standards apply? I think along with the same concept then, of shouldn't the same impact fees proportionate apply?
Commissioner Olson?
I just wanted to say I agree. I don't have any issues with proportional fees for DADUs. I think the point being made around reutilizing existing space, I think, is really what I care about, right? I think there's a difference between, let's use missing middle as opposed to an ADU for the sake of an example, making it a duplex, taking a single family house, don't change anything else, but you turn it into a duplex. I don't see why we would want to put fees on that. They're already it's already going to cost a bunch of money to do that. And a developer isn't going to be going in necessarily and doing that. Or if they are, I think it's going to be a hard way to make money. But if they're adding square footage, that's where I think it changes and it'd be proportional.
I'll add on because I intended to say this. I think this is one more example where we're getting into that terminology trap here of a modern ADU versus the traditional accessory unit. I think what you've described is if a homeowner is going to make alterations to their house to accommodate a family member, a granny flat, a live-in, that's not what we're talking about here when we talk about ADUs missing. That's an accessory unit, and I think that should follow a different set of rules. Taxing that any different, I don't see how that would change really the assessed value of the house. So yeah, I think, but we need to be here, I think, in our code going forward, making that distinction between additional accessory unit or ancillary unit. And what we're really continuing to describe as ADUs are really not the same thing.
Okay, so I'm not actually hearing a clear voice here about impact fees and ADUs, which was the question that we were asked to address tonight. Did you hear it, staff or Nick? Clear direction on that question?
I think there was some interest in having a proportionate share. I'm not sure if there was 4. That would be the first question. And then the second one about ADUs, it was a question, and there was a couple that were interested if it was an increase in footprint or square footage of having to pay something, whether it was a some sort of detached unit.
Okay, so Commissioner Macias and then Commissioner LaSalle.
Could there be code that writes impact fees for, is it an ADU that's owner occupied versus an ADU that's for sale? Does that ever?
We can't get into the owner part was part of the law that you
Oh,
can't
that's
kind of
right.
require it. So we
Okay.
can't go down that path.
And it would be difficult to, even if you could, because at the time it's built, someone could say, I'm leasing it, but at a later time you could change, like it just depends, so it would be tough.
Commissioner LaSalle?
Yeah, thanks for that. I think what I heard, and I agree with what everybody else said, is there's an interest in tying fees to intent, which makes it complicated, because that's really what we're trying to, what we would like to encourage. It is, so going back to ADUs, what I think I heard, or at least what I feel I'm agreeing to, so please let me know if I misunderstood, is going back to what Commissioner Vanderland said in what do we want to encourage? I think collectively what I've heard is we want to encourage ADUs. for the historical familial aspect of it, or the close family unit element of it, to which I would encourage how we can break it down based on what is an ADU that kind of fits that. So if they have a kitchen, if they have all the utilities, et cetera, are we in an ADU situation? And then the part that we do want to encourage is missing middle, to which a fully fledged out DADU is maybe not that different to missing middle. And going back to the part I mentioned, and I thought I heard as well elsewhere from other commissioners, is if we are looking to encourage maybe more building up, protecting trees, protecting the impervious areas, and not necessarily extending sprawl, then DADUs, by definition of just being detached within the lot, and so having more of a sprawl, would not be necessarily something that we would want to encourage all that much. And so therefore, maybe fees should reflect that. Hopefully that helps.
Okay. Yeah, again, I think we've got direction on how to bring back the impact fee discussion. We don't have to make a decision. You don't have to make a decision tonight on exactly how to adjust impact fees, but I think we've got enough direction now to understand what's important and bring back a potential option, because there are a few things that I think we'll need to research, so.
Okay, if they can be very brief, I would like to move on. So very briefly, Commissioner Vanderlyn and Commissioner Olson.
Briefly, for staff and consultant to consider, what I see as the primary distinction, modern ADU and single family, is the fact that you've got a single unit ownership subdivision situation. So you have a separate tax situation, you have ownership and probably separate financing. Very different from the accessory dwelling sort of situation where you don't have that. You're not going to develop that second floor, which is going to be renovated for personal use, as a separate unit that's going to have a separate ownership and then would have to be separately taxed. So I would encourage you to think about that as one of the options of how we would distinguish between what these are and why they're what's common about them. The fact that they are separately owned, they've got title on that separately identifies them, and even for the attached, you've got a condo type of situation where you have separately identified units, separately identified ownership, separately identified title.
Okay, very briefly, Commissioner Olson.
Yeah, I would say I would like whatever the codes we have to ensure utilities are separated so that they can be split more effectively. I think that might take some coordination with NUD and PSE and some other folks on what types of meters and whatnot. Don't need to get into details of that, but just it might not start off as being a condoized unit, right? It might start off as a ADU, that's a grandmother suite, and then people move, grandmother passes away or whatever, and they sell the house, and then it ends up being condoized 10 years down the line, right? And so, but making sure we have code in place that allows for that transition, at which point in time there'd be a split in tax is how I kind of imagine this. And I completely lost my other point, so I'm gonna call it.
Okay, so for the next portion of our agenda, Nick, we had City of Kenmore, well, I guess maybe this is Debbie and Todd. We had, or it's all of you probably, City of Kenmore Municipal Code update for middle housing and ADUs, and there was the blue changes in the code. What would be helpful for you from us? Do you want to go through each page to see if we had comments, or would something else be helpful?
I think in general, the direction you've given so far about wanting to maintain existing bulk standards for single family with some potential incentives for deviation from that if certain requirements were hit is pretty clear. And so that's pretty what's reflected in the code right now.
Okay.
I don't know that we necessarily need to go through page by page to go through the code. That's probably not. You mean, you're certainly welcome to do it and give us instruction. And then when we do bring back the full code, we can go by page by page. I think right now that the draft provided was really to give you all a sense of what it would look like. I think tonight we've got enough direction to finalize it up and then bring it back to you to be able to do a more kind of in-depth walkthrough for that.
Yeah, just to interject, so our intention was to get the feedback that you needed, or Nick needed tonight, give you a kind of a sneak peek of what it currently looks like, and then Debbie and I would come back at subsequent meetings, you know, the next one or two before you go to public hearing. So Nick and Claire will kind of modify based on the feedback that you gave, and then we can go over that more in depth at our next meeting, just focusing on the code and additional questions before we come up with a final draft.
And similar to how we've done in the past, we can provide sort of a table that specifies what the changes were. So it's not just you reading through a couple hundred pages of code to see what changed.
Okay. Vice Chair Thompson.
All right, now, there were a couple things that in the memo, you mentioned that you received direction, or we received direction, or there's some agreement with the council and the planning commission. First of all, there was never an agreement with the planning commission. I want to be sort of clear with that. And what I'm concerned about is that those, you know, the 2575, let's take that one. There has been no public comment on that yet. So as a commissioner, I want to make sure that the public feels as though they have an opportunity to comment. We may completely agree with the city council. I'm not saying that, but I think we need to have a clear, open process. So if somebody wants to talk about that, it's certainly available for someone to discuss, or because you pointed out a way to do 15 and 85, I think, in your memo, because you looked at what the environmental group was, or whatever you said in your memo.
I think that just the areas identified currently add up to 15%. And so it's not necessarily a change. It's just that it needs to be under that 25% threshold. So.
Right. So I'm not saying that I want to go against what the council suggested, but I want to make it very clear to the public that we are, at least my view, we are open for comment on other opportunities, so that when we do go to the council and we have kind of done our process and we ended up like they would like to see, from what we heard, that it's not a done deal just because we heard something from the council. I'm very concerned about public ability to speak to issues so that they don't feel it's a done deal. Is that fair? Do you understand what I mean?
Looked at Debbie or Todd, but I think your planning commission hearing would probably be the venue for that.
I don't think anything was a done deal. You had the joint meeting to kind of get, first of all, on the same page in terms of the framework and context and some of the key policy decisions. And I think at that joint meeting, there was interest expressed by planning commission members and council on the alternative compliance. And what Nick has presented is saying that if you were going to exempt R1, which seemed to meet some of the prior planning commission discussion on doing that, this is one way to do it. So I don't think it's a done deal.
You know what I mean. I don't mean
So
that
it
we're
would
not-
be like any other, we're not there yet. So we're currently developing the direction that we're going, and and the public's welcome to provide comment they've been providing comment from here on in. We have received some comment. The formal way would be at the public hearing, and then you would then, like any other thing that you've taken on, you would be providing a recommendation to the council. So I didn't see that joint meeting as being a conclusion or shortening the process and the transparency of the process.
Thank you for stating that.
Okay, we are approaching 10 o'clock and I think we're almost done, but I'm going to look to the clerk to find out if we officially need to extend the meeting so we can finish up.
That is up to the planning commission if you all decide to extend according to the scope
But
and rules.
Madam Chair, I move that we extend the time limit for the meeting by 15 minutes.
Second.
Okay, it's been moved and seconded to extend our meeting until 10:15. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Aye.
Okay, so the motion passes. We will extend our meeting till 10:15.
That means we can leave at 10:05, but we're legal to 10:15.
Yes. Okay, so we're gonna wrap up now. Staff and Nick were just suggesting that we are still in process, that there is more to come. There is room for public input. Any commissioners, do you have any questions or comments? Commissioner Olson?
I remembered my comment earlier. As far as the proportional fee for DADUs and ADUs goes, trying to simplify that based off of maximum unit size, since it looks like there are some requirements around that or code around that, I think would be beneficial. And just for the rest of the commission, even if that means the total proportional cost might be higher for smaller ADUs and DADUs, just to make it consistent, something where smaller developers or, a family doing it doesn't have to go in and then draw limits of square footage and all of that, which is going to be more difficult for those groups. So trying to come up with like a proportional amount based off the average. And then related to that more directly in the code, I noticed there was this thing about the 6,000 square feet or less. And I was wondering, it looked like we amended it to be 1,000 square feet if it's under 6,000 square feet for ADUs or DADUs, but then it was 10% of the lot size over 6,000 square feet. And it just seemed odd to me because I would think it would be 10% of the lot size if it's over 10,000 square feet for a 10,000 square foot lot, because otherwise you can build 1,000 square foot ADU or DADU, and then all of a sudden you can only build a 600 square foot ADU or DADU. I don't think that was the intent, but I just wanted to voice that. So
Yeah, we'll double check. The change that you're speaking to was the city can't mandate under 1,000 square feet anymore. That's one of the changes in 1337. So I'll double check the language there. I know there are some tweaks.
that's what I thought, yeah.
So we'll take a look at that.
Okay, so before we adjourn, Debbie and Todd, can you talk us through what will happen at our March 4th meeting?
So, as I stated earlier, our Nick in the process of, we'll gather our notes collectively that we heard from you tonight. And then, Nick will take that and craft a new, amended draft. We'll probably, I would suggest we probably have like an errata sheet or something that shows those changes that from the initial draft to the new, just to address that. And then Debbie and myself will be back at the next meeting on, is it the 4th? That will go through the draft code and then address any other additional questions that you might have based on that.
All right, and then at that point, we'll set our intention for the March 18th meeting. We'll know how far along we are and how much time we need.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, great. So if commissioners, when you're looking at the next draft, if you have simply like line edits, like comma or misspellings, you can send them directly to Debbie and Todd, so we don't have to spend time on that in the meeting. And anything else for the good of the order? I would like to say thank you so very much to both Debbie and Todd for being wonderful stewards. And thank you so much, Nick, for your support as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, very much appreciate all of your hard work and staying with us until this late hour. So with nothing else to come before us, this meeting is adjourned at 10:04.